I'm going to start with a David Foster Wallace story. He was an incredible novelist. He died in 2008, and he gave a commencement address to Kenyon College, and he started it with this story. Two younger fish are swimming, and as they're swimming, approaching them is an older, wiser fish. And as he passes, I say he, don't know, as the older fish passes, it says to the two younger, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And they swim on by, and as they swim by, one of them says to the other, "What the hell is water?" And, the fish, the point of the story is the fish aren't aware of the water they swim in. They don't think, just like I don't think about the air. I mean, I know, of course, from studying it in school and everything, what air is made of and so forth, but I'm seldom aware of it. Well, I had something similar in my life, and that is I grew up and the air that I was breathing was stories. And my life was filled with stories all my life. From the time the beginning of my memory, it's all about stories. I came from two families of storytellers. On the Kirk side, they were all great storytellers, but in particular on my Finney side, my mother's family side, who all came from Ireland, many back before the Revolutionary War. But my mother was an incredible storyteller. In fact, just shortly before she died, I was with her for a few weeks, and one Saturday afternoon, some people came to visit. And in an afternoon, my mother told the most compelling story of her entire life. It was just out there. It's kind of like people say your life flashes before your eyes. Well, if you're a storyteller, I guess it does, but it flashes in stories. So I have this book that I treasure. It was my mother's book. It's called Old-Fashioned Fairy Tales. And she won this in 1928, when she was in the second grade. She won a storytelling contest as the best storyteller in the school. Her sister, my Aunt Virgie, was another awesome storyteller. In fact, I was raised in the Baptist church, which has something called character stories. They're not Bible stories. They're more contemporary, but they teach values and so forth. And my aunt was the character story lady. And so she told stories in Sunday school, vacation Bible school, all those kinds of things. But I never thought of stories as being a thing, even though, it was 1950. I was in the second grade before we got a television. I'm showing my age. I was born in 43. So what did we do? We sat around and told stories. Sat on the front porch in the evening and told stories. Had family gatherings and reunions and told stories. I was a child most of the time, so I very seldom felt I got the whole story. Sometimes they were told in whispers, or sometimes I was asked to leave the room, or different things like that. So I had to become what I called myself a story sleuth and try to figure out what the whole story was. I will never forget when my grandfather died. I was a senior in high school. That was 1961. And I had never really been to funerals. Nobody in the family had died. That's kind of surprising, I guess. But my grandfather had 9 children. Actually, she was pregnant 14 times, but she ended up with 9 living children. And when my grandfather died, they were scattered all over. The youngest was in Santa Clara, California. There were some in Washington and different places. But they all came back for my grandfather's funeral. I was expecting morose demeanors and tears and gloominess and sobbing. It wasn't that at all. They were having fun. They were laughing and telling the stories of their youth, stories about each other, stories of my grandfather, stories of my grandmother. I just was stunned. I thought, how can they do this? But, I'm so glad they did. I got to hear them, and I don't believe all 9 of them were ever together in a group again. By the time my grandmother died, my father and 2 of his brothers had died already. She lived to be 96. So they never gathered again. And I feel that they were so fortunate to have that time in telling stories. And I was so lucky to witness that and understand that, they were witnessing their lives together that their grandfather and grandmother really had created. So But growing up, it never occurred to me that storytelling was a thing. If I had said to somebody, well, I'm going to be a storyteller when I grow up, they would have laughed at me. I mean, a storyteller? Well, we're all storytellers, so what's new? It's like saying I'm going to be a human being when I grow up. So I never even thought about it. I never thought about telling stories or it being a thing. It was like, water, what's water? Until I was well in my 50s, and I was working for Ernst & Young, and I was in their leadership and organizational development department, where I had transferred from career with them in IT and project management, and I was teaching classes. And we always had to do assessments at the end and get the students to tell us what they thought of the class. And I always got great comments about my stories. Oh, we love Dorothy's stories and so forth. Now, I was telling stories. I wasn't, oh, there's Dolores. Yeah, I was telling stories. For example, I had to teach a project management class. Well, project management is a lot about risk management. And as many of you know, I was raised by the consummate risk manager, so I knew a lot about risk management and what's involved. So I would tell stories to illustrate points, principles, or concepts that we were dealing with. And I always got great reviews about it. So I thought, well, maybe there's something I can do with that. You know, it never occurred to me before. But you know, since I've gotten involved in storytelling seriously, which didn't happen until I was about 66 years old, I realized that a lot of people get into storytelling through teaching. Donald Davis, who is just the most famous storyteller in the United States. Has anybody ever heard about Donald Davis? He was formerly a Methodist minister, and he still does participate in that. Even, I used to think for a while that a lot of people would go, and that was when I was young. I think it's changed. It might have been more a Baptist thing. I think that a lot of people went into the ministry because they like to tell stories. Just as they, often teachers got into storytelling through teaching, as I did. So when I thought I would tell a story today because we're in this lockdown and going through a pandemic, and there are a couple of things that were important in my youth that are important to me now. One is food, and the other is stories, so I can combine the two. My mother had one nutritional rule in all my growing up, and that is we had to have a pot of beans every day. And that was, we did, it's just every day. And, you know, most of the time they were dried beans, like pinto beans, navy beans, other, you know, lima beans, other kind of beans, black-eyed peas, any kind of legume. So she, and all the women in town at that time, most of the time we grew up, you know, it was after the war. It wasn't, we weren't wealthy or anything. So and beans were a great source of protein, and we ate them every day. But, you know, you have to put the beans on and cook them a long time. So my mother and the women would put them on, you know, shortly after lunch, or sometime after lunch if you're going to have them for dinner, supper, we called it then, or earlier after breakfast if you're going to have them, you know, for lunch. So years ago when I was working as a consultant in California, I had a friend out there, matter of fact, Barbara, some of you know Barbara, and she came over to, I had an apartment, came over to my apartment one night to eat dinner. And I said, what we're going to have. I said, we're going to have chicken. We'll have this. I said, but we need something green. And she said, well, what about green beans? I said, green beans? Are you crazy? We haven't got time for green beans. She said, what are you talking about? I haven't got time for green beans. I said, well, we should have had those on after lunch if we were going to have them, because in the South, even green beans were cooked for hours. In fact, if you go over to Karamai or something, they have what Barbara calls mushy green beans. They have cooked and cooked. They put them on shortly after lunch. I did not know until I was already 50 years old that you could eat green beans just lightly steamed or sauteed. Crunchy, al dente green beans. So beans have always been, one story I shouldn't probably tell, but this was years and years ago. I was living with somebody who was working on her PhD in literature. I don't know if she sees this, but she might. I don't think so. And my mother came to visit us, and I was doing all the cooking. Well, I like to cook, so it wasn't a problem. And my mother says, well, why isn't she doing some cooking? I said, well, she's working on her dissertation. She hasn't got time, and I like to cook. She says, well, the least she could do is put on a pot of beans. So that was really important that we had that. So I have the story of my mother's. I tell stories. The kind of stories I tell are memoir stories, personal stories. I don't tell Jack tales. I don't tell Cinderella stories. I don't tell stories to children. I mean, all those things are great because I grew up on them, but that's just not what I do. I tell memory stories from my memory. And some of my stories are stories that my mother told me, or my aunt told me, or somebody else told me. They're not always my own personal stories. This is a good way for me to keep a connection with my mother, my grandmother, my aunts, various things, if I continue to tell their stories. So this story I'm going to tell today is one that my mother told me many times. And it has to do with food, family conflict, and reconciliation. My mother was the youngest child of 9. She was a change of life baby. When she was born, her next older sister was 7 years older, then the next older sister was 14 years older. And that next older sister that was 14 years older was named Elizabeth. And Mama told me that Elizabeth had been dating a boy named Zeddy that Elizabeth's parents, my mother's parents, did not approve of. They did not want her going out with him. They didn't like him. They didn't think he was suitable material for being a husband, yet Elizabeth was just head over heels in love with Zeddy. Zeddy was his name. The reason my grandparents didn't like Zeddy is that he was a mandolin player. And he played he played the mandolin in beer joints and different places there in the South. And the grandparents just did not think that was appropriate. They would never let Elizabeth go with him when his band played in some of these honky-tonk places. And they didn't think he was at all suitable husband material. I mean, how could you make a living playing the mandolin? I mean, just like they would have said, my God, how can you make a living telling stories? So they didn't want her to see him. Well, Elizabeth was I think she was of an age where she couldn't get married without their permission unless she eloped to South Carolina, which a lot of people did in North Carolina. They went just over the border to York, South Carolina, where a lot of people got married. In fact, my mother and father did the same thing. But one night after dinner, Elizabeth was at dinner, the grandparents said, well, Elizabeth, you staying in tonight? And she said, yes. And it said something about Zeddy was playing over somewhere or other. And then parents retired went to the front porch for the evening, and Elizabeth went to her room and so forth. Well, the parents were sitting on the front porch, and while they were out there, they later said they had seen this man walk by that they did not recognize, but they didn't think anything of it. It was city street. Sometimes people walk by because they lived right across the street from the National Cemetery, where there are a lot of Confederate soldiers buried and military people and so forth. So they thought it was somebody visiting there. But then later on, they found out that Elizabeth wasn't at home and they couldn't find her. And they were all very concerned. Well, the next morning came and they found out that Elizabeth had arranged, Zeddy had gotten her a suit of boys' clothes, men's clothes, shoes, hat, the whole thing. And she had sneaked those things into the house and dressed up as a boy and a man and went down through the backyards so that it looked like she was coming up from the street, walked by her parents who were sitting on the front porch, who did not even recognize her, and went to get in Zeddy's car, and he was waiting nearby, and they headed to South Carolina and got married. Well, her parents, especially her father, my grandfather Obadiah, they were so furious with her because she had deceived them, and they didn't like Zeddy, and so they vowed never, ever to let him in their house, ever. So Elizabeth moved in with Zeddy. I don't know anything about their living quarters or where they were living, but I do know they were very poor, often hungry. She didn't have a job. He was a mandolin player. They didn't have very much. Well, they loved their daughter, and they forgave her and allowed her to come to the house. but they would not let Zeddy come into the house. So he would, every evening, Elizabeth would come for dinner because she needed to eat. But Zeddy would have to wait outside on the street while she came in and ate. They would not, the grandfather would not let him in. My grandmother didn't feel quite as hard toward him as he did, but he felt they had played a trick on him and he was not happy. But my grandmother always packed up leftovers for Elizabeth to take home so that Zeddy would have something to eat when he got home. But, and she was trying to learn to cook. So also Elizabeth would come over and her mother would help her learn to cook and everything as she would have to do. Well, this had went on for quite a while. And of course, at some point, my Aunt Elizabeth got pregnant and was going to have a baby, and they were still doing this. So Zeddy would come with her, but he'd have to wait out on the street. Well, one day my mother said that that Zeddy was out on the street and she went out to talk to him, although she'd been instructed not to ever speak to him. And he said, "Oh, Lois," Zeddy was known to love food. He just loves his food. He said, "Lois, what's your mama cooking for dinner tonight?" She said, "Well, it's pinto beans, cornbread, turnip greens, and speaking meat." He said, "Oh, Lord, I just would love to have some pinto beans and cornbread." That was his favorite dish. He said, I'll give you a quarter if you go in and ask them if I could just come in and have something to eat. So my mother went in and said, "Well, you know, Zeddy said he was really hungry. He looks very hungry. And he loves pinto beans. Could he come in and have some beans with us and cornbread?" Well, everybody looked at my grandfather, and Elizabeth looked at him very pleadingly. And he got up, and they didn't know what was going to happen. But he went outside and walked across the street where now Zeddy was sitting on the curb. And as Zeddy saw him coming, he jumped up to scramble away. And my grandfather stopped him. And they talked a little while. My grandfather sat down on the curb with him. And they talked a little while. And finally, my grandfather got up, and Zeddy got up too. And my grandfather put his arm around Zeddy, and they walked inside the house. And they sat down that night, and my grandmother set a place for Zeddy. And they sat down that night, said grace, and enjoyed a pot of beans, turnip greens and pot liquor, cornbread. And thereafter, Zeddy was always welcome. And it's just a story of later. I wondered what changed my grandfather, what made him change his mind. And I think it was maybe his daughter having a baby. Maybe it was his becoming a grandfather. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe it was just the time of it all, or maybe it was the fact that Zeddy was hungry. How could he leave him out there on the curb knowing he so much wanted pinto beans? And so that's my story about beans. And I think it's particularly important now because I think about what I've been cooking. I've got a whole pantry full of dried beans that I make during this pandemic. And I realized that was a large part of my heritage, but I don't put on a pot of beans every single day. Now, the one thing I want to tell you about my storytelling is that my one rule, now I'm cueing the picture, my one rule is that stories should be truthful, but they don't have to be factual. Do you have that picture? There. That is a picture of my grandmother, Cornelia, and my mother. This was taken in 1920. Oh, that's not the picture that I thought I sent. Shoot. Did I send another picture, Megan?
I'll go check, but I think
okay. It doesn't matter. Let's just put it this way. At the time this picture was taken, they took another picture of my Aunt Elizabeth, who was 14 years older than my mother, holding my mother. Now tell me, what wasn't factual about my story? My mother could not have been old enough to go out on the street and talk to Zeddy. So I wrote it that she did go out and talk to him and came in and talked to the grandparents as a way to, I knew the story, but I never knew the whole story. So I didn't know how it was that on that particular day, my grandfather relented and went and got Zeddy and brought him into the house. So I invented the fact that my mother went out and talked to him and came back and told my grandparents. But that's not the way it happened, because my mother would have, if my Aunt Elizabeth was 16 years old, my mother would have only been 2. So I don't know how that happened. But as I've been thinking about this and preparing this story for today, I decided that I could leave that whole thing out about my mother going out there. I can just say something like Elizabeth said, begged her grandfather, said, Zeddy's so hungry. He's working so hard. He's got a job. I might have to make up something. The point is, I believe the story is true. The story is true. It did happen, but it's not exactly factual in that my mother could not have gone out. My mother probably could not remember that event. She heard it as a story and repeated it to me. And this would have happened, let's say, my Aunt Elizabeth was born 14 years younger than my mother. My mother was born in 20. So she was born in 2006. So when she was 16, it must have been 1922, perhaps. So that's the story. And any questions or comments?
I loved it. I was hanging on to every word.
Me too.
Do you think it's odd to have a story about beans?
No.
Oh,
Now I want some pinto beans and cornbread. We're gonna do it.
But
did
How
you
do you
ever?
cook your beans now?
I have an Instant Pot. Now, there's the question of whether to soak them or not when you have an Instant Pot, because technically you wouldn't have to soak them, but I've done both. And, it takes no time at all in an Instant Pot.
I know. I'm the only one in my family who doesn't have one.
Oh,
Every Thanksgiving, they talk about what is the latest gadget that they just had to buy.
And I just heard of someone here whose Instapot blew up on Easter Sunday. He
Oh,
has
dear.
second and third degree burns, both arms, chest and
Oh.
abdomen.
well, that's what the Instant Pot is this pressure cooker. And I used to have an aunt that cooked with a pressure cooker. And that was always the warning they would give you. You'll end up with a meal on the ceiling or something like that. But I've had no trouble with it. But it does have this vent. And you have to be very careful about releasing the steam and making sure the steam's released before you just open the lid.
Well, have you all ever heard of cornbread?
What?
Cornbread.
No?
For
Isn't
some
that
reason,
just cornbread?
No.
yep. And for some reason, my mother, who was not a hick, would say cornbread, and I would roll my eyes every time she did it. Another thing about telling stories in our family is that my mom and her sisters-in-law would talk Pig Latin. And so Uncle Si was this rich uncle that had a convertible and his own airplane, but he was running around with his secretary, but we didn't know that because they were talking Pig Latin the whole time. Do you know what that is?
Yes.
Yes.
I had a friend that
I
just
used to
called
do it
somebody
as a
an itch bay.
Oh, okay.
child. Yeah.
And then there was Uncle Bud, and my aunts had a home on Highway 11 right outside of near Pickens, near Table Rock State Park, and Mr. Bud lived in the woods behind that house, and Mr. Bud had false teeth, and he would come over many nights and sit on the porch with us and tell us stories, and his teeth clacked. And I remember a lot about Mr. Bud, not much about the stories, but the way he looked. I mean, he was like this mountain man that, anyway. So stories are such a part of my history.
Where did you grow up?
In Greenville, South Carolina. Where were you?
Salisbury, North Carolina.
Okay. Did you know Don Sturkey?
No.
Another story. That's okay.
I left Salisbury in 1961 when I went to college, and I kept up with family and some close friends, but I've really not been in Salisbury for a long time.
Yeah.
I have a little story about pressure cooker if you want to hear it.
Absolutely do. Tell.
When I was in college, my girlfriend and I, we went to college together, decided to make split pea soup. And she said, well, we can do it in the pressure cooker. Well, I don't know if I'd even used one before. So we were at my mom's house where I was living when I went to college. So we did split pea soup in the pressure cooker. And at one point I heard this noise and I grabbed her and I said, Betty, let's get out of here. And I dragged her around the corner and the thing blew. The top went off, the little spigot went off, there was split pea soup going up in a plume and split pea soup going off that way. And of course we had to clean up the kitchen, which was really interesting. And we got it all cleaned up. And years later, when my mother had her kitchen remodeled, she had the vent hood replaced, and way up in there was petrified split pea soup. And that's my story.
Well, my mother used a pressure cooker as well, and she was about to go to a wedding 2 days in advance. She cooked something, and for the first time in her experience, the pressure cooker exploded in her face. And she immediately got cold water and ice. And my father drove her to the hospital, and they kept cold packs on her face most of that day. And then they released her. And she went to the wedding, and nobody could tell that she had been burned so badly. But to this day, I'm afraid of pressure cookers.
You know, there are all kinds of cautions with the Instant Pot. Like, you don't ever lean your face anywhere over near that little steam valve. And even your hand, if you can release the steam. You can, when you cook something, you can either do a natural release, which means you just let it sit for minutes and minutes until the steam just dissipates. It might take 20 minutes. Or you can do a controlled release with the valve, but you have to stay plenty out of the way. I always wear heavy cooking glove kind of things, you know, if I want to release it that way. But I've used it a lot. Knock on wood. I shouldn't say that. It's worked pretty well.
Well, I've heard so many stories, as I said, you know, every Thanksgiving. Well, I made this and cooked 5 minutes, this oatmeal, steel cut oatmeal.
Oh, it's great for steel cut oats.
Yeah. So I hear all those stories.
It's also great for boiled eggs.
Pardon?
It's great for boiled eggs. Doing them in the Instant Pot makes it easier to peel and everything.
Oh.
And risotto. I
love risotto.
Great in the Instant Pot.
Yeah,
Wow.
it is. I made it with shrimp last couple of weeks ago. It was really good.
Risotto?
Yeah. Yeah, the residual heat from the rice actually cooks the shrimp, so you don't have to cook them separately.
That's right.
Oh my goodness. I still have my original pots and pans.
Oh, wow.
Oh, listen.
Well, they're copper bottom stainless steel, and you know, missionaries don't earn a lot of money, so what you get, you keep.
I have a whole cabinet full of family cast iron skillets.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
I only kept
I'm
one.
sure I have my grandmother's cast iron skillet. Probably the same cast iron skillet that cornbread was made in that she served as Eddie that night.
Yeah. I made a red snapper. I just Googled a recipe. I don't know what I'm going to do with my cookbooks, probably throw them away.
Exactly.
But I Googled a recipe and it said fry it 1 minute on each side and then stick it in a 400 oven for 5 minutes. And I did it in the cast iron skillet. Boy, it was delicious. It went, and the secret I learned was into the olive oil, the chef said, pour some salt because that will make a crust. And then he said, put a little bit of flour on it, just barely. And since I try to be gluten-free, I used almond flour. Yeah, just barely. And just 1 minute on each side, and then 5 minutes in the oven at 400. And I thought, this is my mother's cast iron skillet, and it's wonderful. But I think I got rid of the rest of them.
Beth and
You're
I
a good
are
storyteller.
We're sorting 2 mothers worth of stuff. So if it's identical pans, we say, who took the best care of it? Which one looks better? Then the other one goes. So we have lots of old pans and things.
And you can't get rid of anything right now, can you? Because all the thrift shops closed. I know Mary Neal says she's gone through her attic, Mary Neal Jones, her attic, every closet, and she's got it stacked up somewhere to donate as soon as the door is open.
We're doing the same thing.
Beth has a secret place at her studio that we're stacking.
Oh, no wonder you're doing your classes on Zoom.
You could have a yard sale there.
Yeah. I guess I could. Yeah.
One at a time could come in.
Only because Sonia and I were going to be in that fence yard sale. You know that fence yard sale? It was going to be in April, then they changed it to May. Now they've moved it to September.
Yeah, the Jaegers were going to do that. And I think they're #1 on the list at Tryon Estates, and something's become available, but because of all of the restrictions, and they always redo everything, which takes about 4 months, they're left not being able to make any progress with that sale. And but they've been working at culling, and of course, as across the street neighbors, it nearly breaks my heart to think that we're not going to have we call them charm hours on Friday or Saturday when everybody's free and there's not something more exciting, and the Shumways we get together. But you know, back to your stories, I had 2 aunts and uncles in St. Louis, neither of whom had children. And I was doing my nursing in St. Louis. And so every time I'd come for a weekend night or something, we would gather at the table and we would have canned tomato, their own prepared, put up, as they said. They put them up in the jars, peaches and tomatoes and fish that they used to catch in Wisconsin and put in a milk carton and freeze. And then they would tell the same stories. They were each, my uncle and my aunt were part of 6 children. My father was the youngest. And they would tell the same stories. And one story in particular, my one uncle would then kind of wipe his eyes and say, yeah, Mom was just such a great person. And I'd be there, 18 years old, listening, and I enjoyed it. But the same stories got told many, many times.
Yeah.
Did you get tired of them?
Pardon?
Did you get tired of them?
No, because I enjoyed watching their faces as they told them.
Oh, how neat.
Seeing their expressions.
People are leaving.
Yeah.
Something's happening.
Sonia left, I think. Must have.
Pardon?
Sonia must have left.
Oh.
Steve left too, I think.
Steve left, okay.
I never got to see Sonia.
She's babysitting my dog so that he wouldn't bark his crazy head off this morning.
And maybe Donna Weiss, I didn't see Donna Weiss. Maybe she didn't turn her video on to be seen.
Had to do with
Pardon?
the iPad and moving around or something.
Yeah.
And my friend Dolores down there, that's my best friend since we were 2 years old.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
No, you tell great stories. And we
enjoyed
tell
doing this.
stories. We tell stories when we gather as a family. And poor Eric, my husband, you know, there are always lots of stories about Dad and other people. But and my granddaughter, who is now 12. Her father, my son, would bring her down when he was posted in New York to give his wife a break, and he'd fly down for the weekend. And I guess she must have been about 9 months old, and she loved the pond in our place. And Eric took her out there in his bathrobe and his slippers, and he was tall, and he got out to the middle stone. And then he began to get a little wiggly, and his foot slipped into the water. And those of us sitting on the deck all went, Eric, how could you? You know, and so every time I see my granddaughter, she says, tell me the story about Dada and how he almost dropped me into the pond.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, without fail, I said, Sonia, you know the story, you tell it. No, you tell it, Gammy. So stories are great.
Before we close, I just have an ending. Are we ready, or anybody else? Go on. At the end of David Foster Wallace's speech, he said, none of this is about morality. This is his speech, or religion, or dogma, or big fancy questions of life after death. The capital T truth is about life before death. It is about making it to 30 or maybe 50 without wanting to shoot yourself in the head. It's about simple awareness of what is so real and essential, so hidden in plain sight all around us, that we have to keep reminding ourselves over and over, this is water, this is water.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you very much.
I enjoyed it. It's good to see you, Pat. I've missed you and Sandra.
Yeah.
Yes, well, Sandra has a 12 o'clock video with some of her classmates who are spread usually all over the world, but right now 3 of them are in England. So she's having and she was in the shower, and I was just sitting down to my computer to do some work, and Sandra said, it's Dottie Jean's time at 11 o'clock. And so I came here, and then I went back for my tea and realized I had all the lights on in the study. And so I went back to turn off the lights and settled myself in a comfortable chair and enjoyed the hour and seeing all of you very much.
You know what?
Thank you, Megan. Thank you for doing this, Megan.
Wait, this is what storytelling should be about. I tell a story, and then y'all tell a story.
Good idea. Sure. Yeah.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, bye, bye.
Bye.